Please welcome Anne-Marie of Procter & Gamble.
Come on! Good morning. How is everyone? Everybody awake? Got coffee, refreshed, ready to go? Awesome, good. I feel like I could have had a video done on me on how to spell Olympica, because it took me quite some time not only to learn the pronunciation, but of course, how do you spell it? All right, so if I can figure out, there we go. You just heard presentation on, from a supplier's perspective, connectivity, what it takes, what's involved, what are some keys, what do you get out of it. Now, let's flip to the other side. I'm going to give you from a customer's perspective, what does it take for a successful connectivity program? And a little bit about me and the work that I've done. I worked for Procter & Gamble for 17 years. In the last 3 years of my career with P&G, I did B2B or ERP to ERP implementation between Procter & Gamble and their suppliers across multiple different regions, multiple different businesses, multiple different plants. Looked at implementing and digitizing and automating many different messages, so think orders, forecasting, automated shipment, notification, those kind of things. And as you can imagine, with all those many messages, with all those many dynamic supply chains, each and every one of them, almost each and every one of them, has different operating strategies, different ways that they're managed, different things that are required. And so through that work, learned a lot about what works well and of course, what doesn't work well. Now, as I mentioned, I worked on digitizing those forecasting messages, those automated order messages, and I worked on the business side. So if you raise your hand at the end and you say, can you tell me how you work with XX segment? That's not me. So I'm not going to be able to answer that question. But what I can tell you about is how we dug into the business processes to understand what goes on to ensure that connectivity program was successful. All right, first and foremost, very important, I got a question for you. Who works for free? Nobody? Any takers? Nobody raising their hand? Nobody works for free? So the first thing that I'll say that's most important is build your business case. Why are you going to go off and do this work? Why is it important? What do you expect to get out of doing this type of work? Why are you going to commit resources? Why are you going to commit time? Why are you going to commit effort? What are you going to gain from it? And as I mentioned, nobody in here seems to work for free, so it's important that you understand the value behind the work that you're going to go off and do. So if we take the simple example of automated order entry, we heard this from what Dorothy said. What kind of productivity efficiencies are you going to get from that work? So in a world where you've got a manual order push, a manual order entry, by automating that, you are going to save time, you're going to save effort, and you're also going to eliminate manual order entries that could occur by typing those in. Now for one message, that's probably a couple of minutes. But if you do that for hundreds and thousands of messages over time, it's going to start to add up and you are going to start to save time and effort and be able to potentially put those resources towards doing other things. Now let's add on to that automation of forecasted orders. If you can get those forecasted orders automatically uploaded into your system, then you should have better visibility of what's to come in the future. And you should be able to improve on your responsiveness. You should also be able to improve on on-time delivery, on-time receipt. So those are just a couple of very simple basic things that should come out of a business-to-business or ERP to ERP implementation. Now what I'll tell you is after doing this work many, many times over, and as you start to dig into the supply chains and understand how these supply chains work, the touches that people are doing behind the scenes and the things that people are doing to make materials move from point A to B to C, you find and you uncover many, many, many different losses. You may find you've got piles of inventory at different places used to cover changes, used to cover unforecasted demands that come out of nowhere that no one was expecting. And you can use that time as you're going through your connectivity implementation as a part of your program to identify those losses, to fix those defects, and drive overall cost out of your supply chain. It's also very important that you understand what kind of supply chains you have. How are they operating? What's going on in the supply chain? Not how you think they're operating, but how are they actually operating? So Are your supply chains very volatile? Do they operate like the wild, wild west? Is there an army of people on the customer side and the supplier side that are constantly manipulating, massaging, ensuring, micromanaging those supply chains to make sure that material gets where it's supposed to be at the right time? Or do you have a very, very mature supply chain where your forecast is always accurate? You have very predictable orders, material is never expedited, it always shows up at the right place at the right time. Now, what's important about understanding the maturity of the supply chain, so do you have a mature supply chain or an immature supply chain, is it'll give you a sense of whether or not you're ready to move full speed ahead with an ERP to ERP implementation. So mature supply chains are normally very ready to do some sort of automation back and forth between the customer and the supplier. These can be done relatively fast, relatively efficient. It can continue to improve on the efficiency of that overall supply chain. Now, the immature supply chains, I'm not saying that they're not ready for digitization and they're not ready for automation, but you need to know that there may need to be different solutions that are required for success. There may need to be additional time spent on identifying those defects, understanding what the problems are, and fixing them prior to doing the automation. So it's just very important that you know what's happening in actuality in your supply chains. Okay, so after you've built that business case, you understand to some degree what your supply chains are doing and how they're operating. The second thing that I'll tell you is that's required is your leadership must be committed. Leadership of the supplier, leadership of the customer, and leadership of the provider. So has everyone aligned on what the business case is? Is there adequate resourcing that's been assigned from both a business standpoint and from a technical standpoint? Do you have a scope that's been clearly defined? Do you know what you're going to do? Have you defined your success criteria? Have you defined your abort criteria? And have you aligned on what sorts of supply chain types and what sorts of supply chain messages you'd like to go off and digitize? Okay, so once we've done that, you've clearly defined the scope, what you're going to do, what you're looking for. The next thing that I'll tell you is the next thing you need to do is understand what type of supply chains do you really have. And basically, I'm not talking about, as I mentioned before, the volatility, mature versus immature. I'm talking about, do you have vendor-managed supply chains or do you have traditional customer-managed supply chains? So from your vendor-managed supply chains, what sort of messages are you sending? What are you actually doing? How will it work? And once the customer receives the data that you're sending or the supplier receives the data from the customer, what are you going to use it for? And are we both on the same page for what that information is going to be used for? If you don't understand that information and you're not aligned, then you could be using data in a way that it's not meant to be used, which can be often catastrophic. So a couple of different examples that I'll tell you about that I learned as doing connectivity implementation. I've sat in meetings with customers and suppliers and we're having discussions where we believe fully and wholeheartedly that we've got a vendor-managed supply chain. And you think, well, how could that not be? And as you start to talk to the customer service representatives and you start to talk to the planners and you start to talk to the manufacturing resources about how the material is received, you find out you have nothing like a vendor-managed supply chain. And in actuality, you have a customer-managed supply chain in the way that it's operating. You've got the planners dictating to the customer or to the suppliers how the material is going to be received, when it's going to be received, and again, lots of touches up and down the supply chain. I'll also tell you another example about having discussions with suppliers where the customer says, I've got a 14-day firm zone. And the supplier says, no, you don't. You have at least a 21-day firm zone. Well, how can that be? Everything that you receive from me as a customer says, my firm order is only out 14 days. And you get the response, something to the effect of, well, I have to go ahead and manually firm out from your planned orders an additional 7 days to ensure that I keep you in supply. And so again, once you start to digitize and automate, you can't have that information not matching. It's key, it's critical that you know how that supply chain is operating. And one more example that I'll tell you, as you start to have these conversations and we all say, okay, yes, let's go automate firm orders. from the customer's perspective. Great, supplier says, great, I can't wait, I'm gonna get a firm order. It's never gonna change, it's never gonna be repeated, and it's gonna be a discrete order. Wait a minute, that's not at all what I mean from a customer standpoint. I'm gonna send you a firm order, it's gonna be no different than today, so yes, of course, it's gonna change, and it may even change more than once. And then I'm also not gonna send you discrete orders because that's not how my system's set up. I plan off a delivery schedule. So you're gonna get delivery schedule orders, which means over some amount of time you're gonna get repeated orders, and also they're gonna change, and so how are we gonna manage that? So being able to really understand the processes, having providers like Olimica there who understands both the customer and the supplier side is extremely beneficial. Okay, so another step in the scope, now that we've done the business justification, our leadership's aligned, we started to talk about the supply chains in this crazy world, how are we managing and what's going on today in the non-connected world, so we're getting ready to connect. We start to talk about what is, I'll say more the technical details. So what's the message languages that we're gonna use? What are the standard protocols? Are we gonna use GUSI, ANSI, et cetera? Is the customer gonna send the data in a GUSI XML and the supplier is gonna receive it in ANSI? And so in that case, do I need my magical black box within Olimica to do things that I don't really know about, but they're gonna handle that complexity for me? And then what path are those messages gonna take? So are there gonna be multiple providers that are gonna touch and translate that information? Are the messages gonna go from customer to supplier to a contractor? You know, what path is it gonna do? And again, as I mentioned before, as you've defined these processes, are you gonna need special setups, special things such as change flags, vendor managed orders, et cetera, that need to be customized for the business solution. So ensuring that you've got all those things clearly defined prior to moving forward with the program. Now, after all this is done, if you take a look at your materials and you go back through and you start to analyze your supply chains, you may say, okay, I've got 100 materials and I feel pretty darn good about digitizing and automating 90, but those last 10, I'm not so sure I want to go do that. So at that point, you may say, hey, you know what? It makes sense. Let's go with these first 90. Let's exclude these 10. Could be you exclude them until you've got successful 90% done and save the last 10 for later, or it could be there's other processes or other solutions that are needed for those 10. The point is, don't just go do it and implement it blindly without any analysis whatsoever. Okay? Last but not least, this is my favorite, sometimes makes me twitch as I talk about it, because in the 3 years, this is probably the point that caused me at least the most pain. And I put the first point up here, connectivity will not fix data accuracy. I know that is a shock to everyone in this room, but it won't. So, and data is a wonderful thing. We talked about all the different sources of data, all the different ways that we can manipulate data, big data, 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 data. But there's also a reason that data is a four-letter word, is because data can also be our worst enemy. It is very important that we take the time, as you go through your connectivity program, to agree on data, make sure that you, the customer, supplier, agree on the accurate data, and then that data is transmitted in the right form or fashion. If you just simply connect without doing any sort of data accuracy validation, all you're gonna do is send bad data a heck of a lot faster than you were sending it before. And potentially this time with catastrophic implications because it's automated directly into your system as a supplier. And I see everybody like, yes, yes, that's why we wanna go lots of times at a slower pace. So some examples that I'll give you of bad data and key data that through implementations I've found were key and critical to check, because you can't go check every single master data element. Too time consuming and not worth it. So understand what data is critical to your customer and your supplier and agree and go check that. So some examples. Is the customer ordering material in kilograms, but you're shipping it in pounds? And is the customer system set up to take pounds, or is it set up to take kilograms? How are you going to deal with that? Does the customer have 2 material codes for a material that you have 1 for? Is that okay? Can you handle that complexity, or is there a solution that needs to be developed, or does that need to be fixed? Do you have multiple ship from or ship to addresses for one ship to or ship from plant? Again, is that okay? Is that a problem? Once you digitize, how is this going to work? Another one, mismatching sales entity codes. This one is probably one of my favorite too. So is the customer ordering from a sales entity of a supplier, the supplier is shipping against a different sales entity, and oh, by the way, we're paying the supplier at a whole different one at a corporate level. And so depending again on what data the systems trigger off of and require to be accurate, this could be something that completely shuts your supply chain down. Excuse me. And I already talked about firm orders. This is another favorite, but it is something that, take the time, go through, align, understand what is the firm zone, so that as you say firm orders, firm zone, what's the time required, and that you're on the same page, and that as the orders are automated, you get accurate firm order times. Now, again, I'm the customer. I'm not going to promise you they're not going to change, but we need to be in agreement, and at least in terms of what is the time frame that you need to adequately be able to plan and ship material. Okay? All right, last slide. So as I mentioned, the last 3 years that I worked with P&G, did connectivity implementation, and worked a lot with Olemica as we did this. And one of the big benefits, of course, that I found from personal experience working with Olemica is they have such a very broad connection base of experience that's very beneficial. So I'm not talking about the technology and the applications that Olemica has and offers. What I'm talking about is, because of their broad customer base, because of broad supplier base, they really understand and get exposure to a lot of very different business processes. And so they understand how, what the customer says, what do they mean, even though it may sound like something different. How do they develop these special tools and technologies to handle those different business needs and supply chain issues that may be needed. And they do this in a way that they still have the standard protocols. They still have the standard messaging types, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, again, being on the business side, I get to think about all of this like it's a big black box. So here's what I need, here's how I need it to show up, here's how my supplier needs it, and I don't worry about the rest. So that type of collaboration has always been extremely helpful to do not only just standard message translation, but communication translation as well. Okay? All right, so any questions on what I just talked about, or not? Any questions at all? Everybody awake?
Anne-Marie, I have a question. In your 3 years at P&G working on the supplier rollouts, you probably worked with quite a few suppliers. What would you say makes a supplier easy to do business with, as you look across that whole spectrum?
Very good question. I'd say first, I'd almost repeat a lot of what I said, but number one, understanding willingness to partner to do this type of work. So ensuring that you've got business resources, technology resources to go forward. And I'd also say a clear commitment, from the supplier to do the work, and to, I'll say be able to commit the value or talk about the value of moving forward with doing connectivity. And then also knowing that there are going to be, unfortunately, some unexpected things that pop up. And that could be in how the business process works, or potentially in how message segments are used or not used. And just being able to partner and work with the suppliers through those solutions, and ensure that there's a successful implementation is always very beneficial. Question?
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how you determine which suppliers are on delivery forecast versus VMI from a business perspective.
You know, I'll give my experience and what I found to be successful or not. So, you know, typically your supply chains that are vendor managed should be ones that are, you know, I'll say high performance. They're efficient. They're relatively predictable. And by that, I don't mean I ship and receive one order every day. By that, my forecast can go like this, but what I need to make sure is that my supplier sees that my forecast is going to go like this. So what's your forecast accuracy? What's your demand volatility? Is it within reason or not? So that's a lot on the, you know, the customer side for ensuring that that information is as accurate as possible. And then from a manufacturing receipt process standpoint, you know, do the manufacturing sites receive on time? Do they receive accurately? Do they receive, you know, with all the correct information? And is inventory correct? Now, from the supplier side, of course, it starts with ensuring that the supplier is reliable. So do I get material within a given agreed to tolerance of quantity and time when I expect it, so that it's repeatable, it's regular? Do we have good communication, either digitally or verbally, for changes in things that may be coming? Those are typically more of the supply chains and characteristics that I see that allow for a successful vendor-managed solution. But if you've got a supply chain that is the exact opposite of that, so I'll go back to the immature supply chain that I talked about, where it's similar to the Wild Wild West, and you've got lots and lots of people that have to touch and manage and massage data, then that's typically your customer traditionally managed supply chain, because unfortunately your customer is the best person to know what changes are coming, even though they may be last minute. Any other questions? It says I have 5 minutes. Okay.
Hi. Did you have to do a lot of change management on your buyer side to understand that things are now electronic versus manual?
By buyer side, do you mean what I would think of as a purchasing organization?
Well, I mean the people actually placing the orders, the procurers.
Okay, yes. So yes, there was change management, there was training, there was, you know, rollout for, you know, how are things going to work. But to be completely honest, the way or the approach was mostly to train people on your standard core work process, on how you plan, on how you know, how that daily work process of cadence of how those orders are generated coming out of the system doesn't change. The only thing that's really changing is how that information is going from the planner to the supplier. And that I mean, and ideally, honestly, that's how you want it, you know, set up. You don't necessarily want a planner to spend hours and hours and hours thinking about, you know, what's going on between the background, how many different providers do I have that are touching this, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say that, you know, the change management was mostly around continue to follow the work process. Know that if you don't follow the work process that you use every day, the implications to that can be much more severe when you're not when you don't have automated ordering. But generally speaking, you know, here's how it works. That answer your question? Oh, and I spoke purely from the business side. From the technology side, yes, there was lots and lots of change. Okay.
Anne-Marie, within your VMI program, are you doing anything with your suppliers on logistics visibility? So you're talking a lot about order automation. What about shipment tracking and automation from you as the customer with your suppliers?
So give me an example.
Well, like I'm your supplier. Thank you very much for your business. We're with Dow Corning, and we appreciate you very much. So when we ship products to you, we're your supplier, are you interested in the value of that logistics visibility while it's in shipment?
Yes. I didn't touch on it enough, but yes, advanced shipping notifications is something that is important, and it is something that was one of the messages that I spend a lot of time working to implement from a visibility standpoint. Now, that's just from it's leaving your facility, en route to a plant. But anything beyond that, some, but again, that's mostly in vendor managed supply chains where, you're sending me, hey, here's my order plan for what it's going to look like over the next, X number of weeks. But yes, lots of work with the advanced shipping notifications.
So beyond, or the advanced shipping notification is giving you alerts for things like that have been delayed in transit, that have longer lead times, anything like that?
It was not that sophisticated. It was simply, Houston, it has left the building, and it is en route. But if anything happened to it along the way, there was no notification that happened. It was simply a message that said, "Up, here it is. I see the shipment notifications en route," and from that, you got to rely on it. Roughly takes this number of days for it to arrive at the facility. Any other questions? 57 seconds. That means it can't be too hard of a question. Okay, well, I thank you all for your time today. Have a great rest of the conference.